Rolf Sachsse is trained as a photographer, studied art history, communication research and German literature in Munich and Bonn. He holds a PhD on the history of architectural photography in Germany between 1900 and 1975. He worked as head of a building preservation campaign concerned with 19th century interiors, a member of the artist placement group in London in the late 70s and early 80s. Since then, he is a freelance author, curator, consultant, and in 2004 to 17, he seated in design history and design theory at the university, and since 2018 is lecturer at the University of Bonn.
Thank you very much. Thanks to Fast Forward for the invitation, thanks to IRO, thanks to Goethe Institute that I'll be here. One preliminary remark, Lucia Moholy spelled her first name Lucia, not Lucia or whatever. And even to her closest friends, she was Frau Moholy, never Lucia Moholy. She was Mrs. Moholy. So that's just for the first sentence. Quote, for a few years of my life, I've taken photographs here. For a few years of my life, I've taken photographs there. But basically, I am not a photographer. I am a writer. With these sentences, Lucia Moholy ended my second two-day interview with her on June 18, 1982. And for 2 of the 4 decades since, I've done my best to betray these words. I've helped to install her legacy as the Bauhaus photographer absolute. It was difficult enough. In the 1980s, more than one museum refused to buy prints of her photographs with the argument they were, quote, too bad in their composition, quote. 6 years after her death in 1995, Elisabeth Morgard and Sabine Hartmann curated a first and beautiful monographic exhibition on Lucia Moholy. And in 2022, a Berlin museum showed nothing but her Bauhaus photographs, which was not a good exhibit. In her heritage, we could find not only larger parts of an autobiography, but several early diaries and letters of all sorts, plus a number of handwritten notes on discussions with Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. They will be the base of what I'm going to tell you. As this lecture is accompanied by a second layer of discourse, photographs and copies of these documents, I have to warn you. The material shown is the result of a life in a number of exiles. There are copies and copies of copies and copies of copies of copies and so forth, often enough in terrible shape and low quality. Thus, receive my apologies for not being able to present better material here. Lucia Schulz's first exile was deliberate. She wanted to get away from home. Born January 18, 1894, a date that took me several years to research, she ran through her childhood in Prague in fast pace, finishing high school with 16, teacher's exam in English and literature with 18, then working in the lawyer's office of her father, plus studying art history at the renowned Prague University, at the time more or less a dependance of the famous Vienna school. But she wanted to leave the family behind, placed an advertisement in Berlin illustrated papers, and received a commission to work within a newspaper in Wiesbaden near Frankfurt on the Main. And this time, she recalls finding some interest in photography, and one of her first excursions from Wiesbaden brought her to the then already famous sisters Nina and Carrie Hess with their large photographic studio specialized in portrait and theater imagery. She even considered studying photography in either Berlin with the Lette Institute for the Education of Women or Munich with the State School of Photography and Reproduction, but she had to give up the idea due to her self-imposed money problems, refusing to receive money from the family and trying to survive on herself as another form of especially female exile. And in the midst of World War I, all of her institutions did not work on full scale. Lucia Schulz proceeded from one publishing company to the next, working in editing and supervising book productions of all sorts, most of the time in Leipzig. Her own ideas at this time were concentrated on a career in writing, and there were some early publications in magazines of leftish circles. In 1919, she came under the influence of Friedrich Vorwerk and Heinrich Vogeler and published a lengthy article in favor of the monument for the 1918 revolutionaries, under the alias name of Ulrich Steffen, another exile. Asked for the reason, she told me that nobody would ever have published this text under a woman's name. In 1980, when the new state was installed, Lucia Schulz became a citizen of Czechoslovakia and lost her Austrian citizenship, not really in exile, but a change in life. In the spring of 1920, she met Laszlo Weiss, who had renamed himself into Laszlo Moholy not 3 years before, and on her 27th birthday, January 18, 1921, they married in Berlin. By this marriage, she became a Hungarian citizen, and he was allowed to stay in Germany despite the threat of prosecution by Hungarian authorities due to his earlier political activities. By the help of Dada artist Kurt Schwitters, they settled in a studio in Spichernstraße, from where Laszlo Moholy took some of his most famous photographs. Until Moholy-Nagy's call for the Bauhaus, both lived on Lucia's income as an editor of several publishing houses. In the summer of 1921 and 22, both spent their vacation in Vajos, a village in the vicinity of the Lowerland School for Women. There it was that both were confronted with the technique of the photogram practiced by Bertha Günther. In 1922, they formulated a text production-reproduction printed in the magazine The Style under his name, although larger parts of the discourse can be traced back to Lucia's earlier writings and thinking. And at that time, Laszlo Moholy wasn't able to write a postcard in German. In the spring of 1933, Johannes Itten had left the Bauhaus School in Weimar and was immediately replaced by Laszlo Moholy, who was equally immediately confronted with the task of setting up an exhibition displaying what the institution had to offer to the local industry at the times of a hyperinflation. The best thing to do in this situation is to produce a catalogue, and the work had to be done by Lucia Moholy. An old wooden camera was present in Georg Mucher's studio. Lucia Moholy received a short introduction by the Weimar photographer Otto Eckner, and off she went. More than 300 product photographs within 4 weeks, each on a glass plate of 5 to 7 inches. The production background was simple too. 2 stools with a glass plate on top, we had glass already, a white and black background underneath, light from the large windows of the studio, and a bit of elucidation with a white cloth on the opposite side. That's been it. When the Bauhaus moved to Dessau, Lucia Moholy received through Laszlo the implicit commission of producing the Bauhaus books. She had the short training in printing techniques at the Leipzig School of Graphic and Book Art, and off she went with the next, now even larger documentation of the Bauhaus buildings and interiors. These are her best-known photographs, and they are the cause for a huge misunderstanding of her life and work. She was by no means only a photographer, albeit the documentarist of great men's work, as in the case of Walter Gropius, Laszlo Moholy and the rest of the boy group called Bauhaus. Lucia Moholy remained unpaid, unrecognized, more or less unknown for all of this work. And all that caused quite some stress in the relation between her and Laszlo. He helped himself out of the situation by becoming the lover of Gropius' sister Ellen Frank, who had to play the role of the housekeeping woman in the advertising film for the Bauhaus Living in 1928. And Lucia Moholy began an intensive relation with the philosopher and art historian Franz Roh, at the time one of the most important art critics in Germany. Already in 1927, Lucia and Laszlo Moholy had begun with the preparations of the entry room of the 1929 exhibition Film and Photo in Stuttgart, today recognized as one of the most important media exhibits of the 1920s. When preparing the Room 1 as the introduction to the history of photography, her interest in this field began, and even more important, the influence of her brother Franz Schulz, then one of the most successful film playwrights in Germany, on Laszlo's film theory gained weight. In 1928, both left the Bauhaus and returned to Berlin. He kept a Spichernstraße apartment, and she found herself another one. Lucia kept working for him and, for instance, did a number of installation shots of his theater sceneries. Both of them switched their personal partners again. He found Sibylle Peach, who gave birth to her first child, Hattula, in 1933, and she, who had already started to teach at Johannes' private art school, became the partner of Theodor Neubauer, then a member of parliament from the Communist Party. Through him, she could manage to take photographs of the leader of the parliamentary group of the Communists, Clara Zetkin, a position that he received after her retreat in 1931. January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler and his gang came into power, held fake elections on March 10, 1933, and on April 1st, 1933, they began with the prosecution of laws and leftist politicians. Early in August 1933, Theodor Neubauer was caught at Lucia's apartment, and she knew that she could not return. The same night, she crossed the Green Border in the direction of Prague, where she met with her family. Understanding that she could not do anything for Neubauer from there, she moved on with her brother, or short after him, the sources are not clear here, to Paris, where they had been a center of communist refugees, and through the Romanian, French, British Princess Lucie Bibescu de Brancova, Lucia Moholy was instigated to meet her mother, Emma Marocadotus, the Countess of Oxford and Asquith, at the time an important figure in European politics. I'm sorry. She suggested to proceed, and so did Lucia Moholy. One of her first portrait photographs in London was exactly the view on Emma Asquith. Before that, she had taken only one image showing the landscape of Surrey in June 1935. Based on the references of several friends, especially Quakers like Ruth Fry, Lucia Moholy could make her living on portrait photography, and soon her tiny studio, plus the park opposite to it, became a spot for celebrities. For instance, scientists like Patrick Maynard Stewart, first Baron Blackett, who not only won the Nobel Prize in 1948, but was an ambitious leftist politician too. In January 1936, Lucia Moholy and Laszlo Moholy-Nagy went to court and were divorced, as he was expecting his second child with Sibylle Peach. By this divorce, she returned to her citizenship of Czechoslovakia. Through her contacts to the scientists, Lucia Moholy worked a lot in the library of Cambridge University and even considered moving there. She took up an old plan that she had had in the late 1920s, and she finished her Cultural History of Photography, which was published in 1939 with the newly founded publisher of cheap books, Penguin. It sold 40,000 copies within 1 year and is today considered as equally important as the works of Giselle Freund or Helmut Gernsheim. Gernsheim copied a lot of his sentences without quoting them. If you read the very three first books of Helmut Gernsheim, it's totally Lucia. In Cambridge, she was introduced into the then new technology of microfilm and understood very clearly the importance of it for the common use of printed material in science. Within 1 year, and the help of a US Reading Society, she set up a full program of bibliographic reproduction, and by the end of World War II, her service ASLIP had copied more than 5 million pages of documents, as she proudly stated in later lectures and articles. She could do so as the Czechoslovakian government was non-existent, except for an exile administration in London, and therefore she was not considered as an enemy, as most of the German exiles had been. In 1944, Lucia Moholy became a citizen of the United Kingdom, now another and real exile. And then there was peace, and the ASLIP service went out of business. Lucia Moholy had nothing to do. She started a number of, as we name them today, startups using microfilm applications, but none of them had any commercial success. Thus, she was instigated to write a memorandum for the founding conference of what later was called the UNESCO, and her proposal was to set up national archives for new, especially post-colonial countries by the help of microfilm applications. Her proposal was so far ahead of its time that it only can be compared to Vannevash Buth's article of the same year, which is today considered to be one of the first ideas of both digitalization and the internet. But again, the attempt failed. Her proposal was not taken. Instead, she held conferences all over Europe on reproduction techniques and tried to survive on consultancy. As well, she had the idea to emigrate to the US, wrote to Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, only to find out that he had died a few days before her letter arrived. She wrote to Walter Gropius and did not receive an answer. In the late 1950s, she had a number of law issues with and against him because of her negatives and the copyright claims of her work as a photographer, because he never claimed her for copyright. In 1949, she went for half a year to Prague in order to help reinstall the National Archives of Czechoslovakia and was thrown out of the country by the Stalinistic Gottschalk government. In the early 1950s, she worked for 2 years in Turkey, where she installed a microfilm department of the National Archives in Ankara. After that, she lived for 1 year in Berlin, editing a commissioned company history. In the 1950s, she had taken up correspondence with Johannes Itten, at whose Berlin school she had been lecturing between 1929 and 1932. And in 1960, he asked her to help with summing up the essence of his lifelong teaching, and thus she moved again now to Zurich, the last of her exiles. Besides editing 2 of Johannes Itten's books, she immediately began to work as an art critic for a number of British and US magazines. And when the Bauhaus came into public interest by the late 1960s, she was the first to comment on its history, and she was the most feared for doing so, due to her harsh criticism on common myths around Walter Gropius, Laszlo Moholy and the rest of the boys teaching at the school. In 1972, she published her marginal notes on Laszlo Moholy and the Bauhaus. At the same time, she began writing an autobiography which was never finished. Her brother Franz Schulz, aka Frank Spencer, had died in Switzerland in 1971, and he had left her the royalties of his films on which she now could live at least on a low level of income. There are 2 biographies on him, both written by his last girlfriend, and they are full of hatred against Lucia Moholy and will have to be revised someday. I have to be very careful with my words, as the lady is still alive and threatening me with legal actions against me. In 1978, the exhibition accompanying a trade fair Photokina showed an overview of 1920s photography, and this was the first time in 1978, she was 84 then, that was the first time that Lucia Moholy was exhibited as a photographer under her own name. The image of the Bauhaus glass facade being shown for the first time ever. The exhibition caught the interest of the publisher and collector Egidio Marzona, whose archive of the avant-garde has just been opened to the public 2 weeks ago, and it caught my interest too. In 1982, I had a first interview with her and published a small article in a photographic magazine, after which she decided that I was the one to write a monography on her, which caused a long line of letters to the editor in Zurich magazines of feminists opposing the idea that a man should write about her. In the years of 1983 and 84, I regularly traveled to Zolikon near Zurich, had interviews with her, and began with the preparation of the book that came out in 1985. First of all, she wanted to have index cards of all photographs available. She put the titles on them, which had to appear as such in the book. Whenever I was in Zurich, there was a number of people around her that helped her through her life. Max Bill was one of the persons, Helga von Sandberg, daughter of the famous director of Het Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, another. After the publication of the first monography in 1985, Lucia Moholy became really famous, which she considered another exile. One of her common quotes of the time was, quote, "I do not know that I'm well known for what I did or for having become so old," quote end. On May 17th, 1989, yesterday, 35 years ago, Lucia Moholy passed away in the Bircher Clinic in Zolikon. Just a few days before, I had the chance to call her on the phone, and she wanted me to take her in the car to a new sculpture by Max Bill, looking forward as ever. With her lawyer, I had to argue about her last will, nearly a Kafkaesque situation. She wanted all personal belongings to be burned and all artworks to be auctioned for the UN Refugee Organization. UNHCR received quite a lot of money from auctioning her collection of paintings by Laszlo Moholy, Wassily Kandinsky and other Bauhaus masters, but the rest of documents, negatives and materials was saved for 2 museums, the Bauhaus Archives in Berlin and the National Portrait Gallery in London. There you can find anything you need on Lucia Moholy, if these archives let you in. Next week, there will be a big exhibition on Lucia Moholy in Prague, in her hometown, in the Kunsthalle. Thank you.